Okay, so last week's message was focused on Joseph and his two sons and Joseph's father Jacob, and just how he blessed them in his final moments. Just such an incredible story. But anytime I think about Joseph and what he went through, I wonder, how does someone who was half beaten to death by his own siblings and then sold as a slave actually end up forgiving them and moving on with their life? And he didn't just say, like, I forgive you and moved on, because Joseph basically saved their lives during a food famine and then brought them all to Egypt so that they could live in a bountiful and blessed land together. Now, I believe the main reason Joseph was able to do this was because of how he processed what he went through. Another way of saying this is how he interpreted his painful past. And so that's our message this morning, how to interpret your painful past. And we're going to look at Joseph as our perfect example. Now, to interpret means to explain or to understand the meaning of something. And if you think about it, we are always interpreting things. It can be from the weather to other people, what do they think of me? Or maybe your boss at work, you try to interpret, are they happy with me? Do they appreciate the work, the time that I'm putting in? Even your spouse. You can be married for 20, 30, 40 years, and if you're honest, there's times that you miscommunicate. You're trying to interpret something they said or their body language, and very often, if we're honest, we get it wrong. Now, when the Pharisees and Sadducees came to test Jesus by asking him for a sign, he said this in Matthew 16, verse 3. Red sky in the morning means foul weather all day. You know how to interpret the weather signs in the sky, but you don't know how to interpret the signs of the times. Now, we might have the ability to interpret some things, but not all things. For the majority of the time, we need God's help. Joseph knew exactly how to rely on God when it came to interpretations. In fact, his life revolved around three key interpretations. The first one is with the cupbearer and the baker's dream. Now, just to give you context, Joseph was a slave in Potiphar's home, and he ended up being thrown into prison after being falsely accused of raping Potiphar's wife. And it was here in prison that he met the cupbearer and the baker. And we read in Genesis 40, verse 5 to 8, it says, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, why do you look so sad today? We both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. Even though Joseph was going through a very hard time, he was still concerned about others and was willing to help. He then says something so powerful. He says, do not interpretations belong to God? From the beginning, Joseph knew not to rely on his own wisdom or his own ability to interpret things. He knew God was all-knowing and that all interpretations belonged to him. And so Joseph listened to the cupbearer's dream, in which the cupbearer saw a grapevine with 3 branches that produced clusters of grapes, and he squeezed these grapes, and the juice went into a cup, and then he gave this cup to Pharaoh. And then in verse 12, it says, "This is what the dream means," Joseph said. "The 3 branches represent 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position as his chief cupbearer. And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it." What an incredible gift God gave Joseph, that he could actually interpret these dreams. I mean, I often have vivid dreams, and to be honest, most of them are complete rubbish and make no sense whatsoever. But there are certain dreams that I just know there's like serious meaning behind it. And it's such a challenge to actually work out what God is trying to say or what the dream means. After Joseph interpreted the cupbearer's dream, he asked the cupbearer to remember him and to hopefully help him get out of prison. Joseph then listened to the chief baker's dream, and he also interpreted it for him. However, it wasn't good news, because the baker was told that 3 days later he was going to die. And so sure enough, 3 days later, Pharaoh restored the cupbearer to his position and had the baker killed. And unfortunately for Joseph, the cupbearer totally forgot about him. And so once again, it seemed like Joseph was let down by people. I wonder how he felt all alone in prison, trying to process what happened. You know, God clearly used him to interpret these dreams. But why? What was the point? What was the reason? How do you interpret that when it seems like God used you, but it was all in vain? Now, it might have made no sense to Joseph at the time. However, 2 years later, Pharaoh has a dream, and he asks his wise men or magicians if they can interpret it, and they can't. Why? Because interpretations belong to God. The cupbearer finally remembers Joseph and suggests to Pharaoh that he must call Joseph to come and interpret the dream. Now, there may be times in our lives that we struggle to understand why we went through something, but God's timing and our timing is very different. And we might only gain some understanding years later, just like Joseph may have in this situation. And then in Genesis 41, verse 14 to 16, it says, "Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I've heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it. It is beyond my power to do this,' Joseph replied. 'But God can tell you what it means and set you at ease.'" For Joseph, there is a lot riding on this moment, because he's essentially in a job interview and a possibility of gaining freedom from prison. And so for Joseph to say, "It is beyond my power to interpret your dream," to Pharaoh, who doesn't believe in God, takes great faith. Pharaoh then tells Joseph his dream, where he sees 7 fat, healthy cows grazing in a field, and then he sees 7 thin cows come, and they eat the fat, healthy cows, but they stay thin. Then he sees 7 healthy heads of grain get swallowed up by 7 shriveled heads of grain. I mean, could you imagine what that means? It's insane. And then God gives Joseph the interpretation, which was, for the next 7 years, there will be great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt, but afterwards there will be 7 years of famine. As a result, Joseph tells Pharaoh to find an intelligent and wise man, and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt, and that he must appoint supervisors to collect 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 good years, and to gather the food in Pharaoh's storehouses, and to store it away for the 7 years of famine. And then we get to Genesis 40. Is it 40? Yeah. Genesis 40, verse 37 to 40. It says, Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. So Pharaoh asked his officials, can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours. Can you imagine how Joseph must have felt hearing those words? I mean, just the joy and the relief of gaining freedom, but then getting this massive promotion. Only God can do something like that. Only He can take someone from the lowest of the low and restore them to a blessed position. What did Joseph do to get this massive promotion? How did he receive the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream? And how did he come across so intelligent and wise when he had never received a proper education? I believe one of the main reasons was because he was humble. He never tried to impress others with his incredible gift, but always gave God the glory. And even in his biggest moment, standing in front of Pharaoh, he could have been so tempted to kind of pretend that he's got this great gift or that he is all wise. But even in that vital moment, he still had that humility. And so humility and dependence on God gained him freedom and a massive promotion. Joseph was put in charge of Pharaoh's court, and during the days of great famine, his older brothers, who sold him into slavery, came and bowed down before him, begging for food. They didn't recognize him at first, but after Joseph sent them home, the brothers returned, and then Joseph finally revealed himself to them in Genesis 45, verse 3 to 5. He says, I am Joseph, he said to his brothers. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. Please come closer, he said to them. So they came closer. And he said again, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me into this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. You might wonder how Joseph's brothers didn't recognize him. But very often the toughest trials we go through end up changing us. This change can be for the positive or the negative. But now comes the third and most important interpretation of Joseph's life. He is no longer interpreting other people's dreams, but he must interpret a very difficult event in his life. The event that took him from his father's home and forced him to endure slavery and false imprisonment. If you were Joseph, how would you process what you went through? How would you be able to get over the pain and hurt and anger and actually move on with your life? Some of you are struggling to understand an event in your life that hurt you or disappointed you, and you can't make sense of it. Maybe you are currently going through something, and at this very moment of your life, the way you interpret it, the way you interpret what is standing in front of you will determine your bondage or freedom. Notice what Joseph said in Genesis 45, verse 5. He says, "But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Joseph says, you sold me, but God sent me. So which one is it? The first one is the event. The second one is the interpretation. It is not the event that determines the direction of your life. It is the interpretation. And you can either try to come up with the interpretation yourself, or you can look to God for His interpretation. After all, do not interpretations belong to God? S. Furtick once said, "Your situation is not as important as your interpretation of it." What if I told you you could be living a happy life, free from your past hurt, but your interpretation is all wrong? Our interpretation is so off sometimes because we interpret other people's reactions through our own insecurities, or we interpret our present struggles through the lenses of our past, and we drag all the pain and resentment and regret with us. Like Joseph, we have a choice. We can either live in the reality of the event or the revelation of the interpretation. In 2014, I think I've shared with you once before, while I was driving home from the Vol Dam late at night, I drove over a pedestrian and killed them. And I hit what I thought was a speed bump or a pothole, and I turned my car around. And I'll never forget that image as I looked in the road and saw this dead body. And to know that I killed someone was very difficult to process. You know, someone doesn't have a son, a brother, or maybe even a husband because of me. And I can blame myself and say, I should have paid more attention, or I should have been driving slower. I shouldn't have been driving so late at night. Or I can believe that interpretations belong to God. And I can believe that despite the tragedy, God was still with me. That God somehow protected me from maybe swerving and rolling my car. And I can believe that through that horrible tragedy or that horrible trial, God strengthened my trust and dependence on Him. That event could have defined my life for the negative, but it didn't. I learned that God doesn't always change the event, but He can use the event to change us. And He can use the painful past for good. Genesis 50 verse 20, Joseph said, here it is, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph stopped focusing on his past and instead focused on his God. And this is where faith plays a major role, because God can use, or God can give us the ability to interpret a situation according to our faith and not our feelings. And so just in closing, how to interpret your painful past. If we look at Joseph as our example, number one, humble yourself before the Lord. Number two, accept that it's not your job to interpret your event. It's God's job. Number 3, ask God to give you his interpretation of your event. And that's where faith over feelings comes in. Number 4, let go and move on. And I think a key to this is forgiveness. If we look at Joseph, the forgiveness that he showed, that's not human. That's not possible. It's divine forgiveness. And Corrie ten Boom, she faced terrible hardships in a concentration camp. And God challenged her to forgive those who mistreated her. And she says forgiveness is setting the prisoner free, only to find out that the prisoner was me. And so forgiveness is such a key part. Number 5, focus on Jesus rather than the hurt. And focus on Jesus rather than the people that may have hurt you or the situation. And number 6, trust God to use your painful past for good. And so my hope and prayer is that if you use Joseph, if we look at Joseph's example, if we kind of do these steps, that you'll also be able to find your freedom and your purpose in life, and you'll be able to move on to better and greater things. Let's pray.